Hello, we're back with another lesson of Malcolm X's Learning to Read. We've kind of covered everything on the rhetorical framework so far, except for a little bit of additional things. So we're going to finish the rest of this section talking about some really important things that authors do when they're trying to reinforce the message that they are making. So if you've missed all the lessons about the rhetorical framework so far, make sure you go and check those out. So here is the question we're focused on mostly today. How do tone and point of view reinforce a speaker's message and clarify their purpose? Well, I think I flipped those, but the point still stands. So tone is a little bit different than mood. So you might have heard these two words used before, okay? Tone is the author's attitude towards a subject, okay? Mood is the audience's perspective about the, let's call it the feeling of a text, okay? So the tone is a little bit different than a mood because a tone is something that an author is doing as they're describing their subject of the text. Mood is how you as an audience member perceive that. So we're going to focus on tone today and not so much on mood, which is something you'll find more often in short stories and poems and things like that. Of course, when we're talking about purpose and message here, we're talking about that central claim. What is that argument that they're trying to build? Okay, so let's go ahead and read this sort of last section. When I discovered philosophy, I tried to touch all the landmarks of philosophical development. Gradually, I read most of the old philosophers, Occidental and Oriental. The Oriental philosophers were the ones I came to prefer. Finally, my impression was that most of Occidental philosophy had largely been borrowed from the Oriental thinkers. Socrates, for instance, traveled in Egypt. Some sources even say that Socrates was initiated into some of the Egyptian mysteries. Obviously, Socrates got some of his wisdom among the East's wise men. First thing first about some of the vocabulary he's using. This terminology is a little bit outdated. We definitely do not use these terms to refer to places or people anymore. But when he is saying Oriental, he does mean what we would call the Far East, which is also probably an incorrect term. He's referring mostly to Asia. When he's saying Occidental, he is talking mostly about Western philosophy, so European philosophy. The reason that these words have fallen out of favor is because Occidental and Oriental are basically positions. So the Occident would be sort of the correct, and the Orient would be the opposite. And that's just not really true. West and East is not really true either. Neither of them are west or east of each other because the world is a globe. So that implies that, especially things like the Far East, it implies east of where? And it's not east of anywhere. It's just where it is. So let's go ahead and look at tone. So I'm going to point out some really interesting things here, which is he is giving us his own personal impression. My impression was that it had been largely borrowed. So he's saying Western philosophers have borrowed their ideas from the East. That is a pretty light statement for him to make, because what he could be saying is they've stolen it. But instead he uses the word choice borrowed, because it's sort of a nudge, you know what he really means. This is where his tone really comes through when he says, obviously. Well, because we haven't read the same philosophy as him, or maybe we haven't read the same works, it's not obvious to us. But him saying that obviously implies a tone here. Think about what his tone is. How does he feel about the subject of philosophy? Well, he feels like it's largely been stolen. Things that we think of as normal and average Western philosophy are in fact not Western ideas at all. This obviously implies that maybe he doesn't think philosophy is so great in the first place. Let's go ahead and keep going. I have often reflected upon the new vistas that reading opened to me. I knew right there in prison that reading had changed forever the course of my life. As I see it today, the ability to read awoke inside me some long dormant craving to be mentally alive. I certainly wasn't seeking any degree, the way a college confers a status symbol upon its students. My homemade education gave me, with every additional book that I read, a little bit more sensitivity to the deafness, dumbness, and blindness that was afflicting the Black race in America. Not long ago, an English writer telephoned me from London asking questions. One was, "What's your alma mater?" I told him, "Books." You will never catch me with a free 15 minutes in which I'm not studying something I feel might be able to help the Black man. Okay, he's sort of drawing his whole claim to a close here. So let's think about his point of view. He does tell us that reading has changed the course of his life, and it actually opened up some dormant craving. That means some deep desire in him that was sort of laying without being awoken. And that's what he actually says. It awoke inside of him. And then he uses some interesting tone here. I certainly wasn't seeking any degree, the way a college confers a status symbol upon its students. Think about that specific point of view here. What is his perspective about college? Well, he sees it as a status symbol and nothing else. And he's kind of right. You can learn anywhere from anything. It's just that piece of paper is the only thing a college can give you. So think about his tone towards education here. How does he feel about it? How does he feel about systems of education? Well, not very positively, because his homemade education is what made him more sensitive to what's going on in America. But perhaps what might be a little bit insensitive here is how he uses this terminology of deafness, dumbness, and blindness. He's using it metaphorically, but for people who actually have these conditions, it might be considered an inappropriate use of those words. What he's really meaning metaphorically here is that America is completely insensitive to the plight of Black people and ignorant about the things that go on in Black Americans' lives and history, not only for Black people in general, but for all Americans who should know this history. Let's keep looking about his tone down here when we get a bit of dialogue. There's not very much dialogue in this text at all. So when we get dialogue, we should be really paying attention to what he's doing. A writer calls him and asks, "What's your alma mater?" Alma mater means basically, where did you go to school? But it does kind of imply mater, meaning mother. It's the same root word there. It's Latin. So you could almost think about it as like, what is the mother that taught you? Where are you from? You know, we use it to mean what university or college did you go to? But here he's saying books. Think about that short response. What do you think his tone might have been when he was talking to that English writer? What's your alma mater? You know, how'd you learn all this stuff? Books. Simple, to the point. Think about the subject here. What's he talking about? Still education and talking about the systems of schooling. How does he feel towards them? Well, the best one he's got, the best education he's ever had has been books. You'll never catch me with a free 15 minutes when I'm not studying something. So he spends all of his time reading to learn so that he can better help himself and others, especially, as he says, the Black man or Black people in America. So if we think about his point of view here, he's really trying to emphasize his claim. How does he feel about all of this? And how does he feel going forward? Let's go ahead and read the next section. Yesterday, I spoke in London, and both ways on the plane across the Atlantic, I was studying a document about how the United Nations proposes to ensure the human rights of the oppressed minorities of the world. The American Black man is the world's most shameful case of minority oppression. What makes the Black man think of himself as only an internal United States issue is just a catchphrase, 2 words, civil rights. How is the Black man going to get civil rights before he first wins human rights? If the American Black man will start thinking about his human rights and then start thinking of himself as one of the world's great peoples, he will see he has a case for the United Nations. I can't think of a better case. 400 years of Black blood and sweat invested here in America. And the white man still has the Black man begging for what every immigrant fresh off the ship can take for granted the minute he walks down the gangplank. Let's look at point of view and tone here, because we're getting a little bit more directed tone. Think about how he uses quotation marks and italics here to provide emphasis. What he's really doing is conveying his tone. So his argument he's making here is that we're largely concerned in America with what we call civil rights. So these are the rights that you get afforded to you by the Declaration, the Constitution, whatever you may have, the foundational documents of America, that you have certain rights like the right to vote, the right to own property, things like that. But what he's actually saying here is that this is just a catchphrase. It's a catchphrase. It's a buzzword that we use. And his tone here is sort of almost pushing it to the side, and just think about how careless it is that we call it civil rights. And that's why he uses italics to emphasize his tone on the next two lines for human rights. If you're not being treated like a human, you're not going to get civil rights, no matter what the law says. So really what he's doing here is taking it from a United States issue of civil rights and making it a worldwide issue by involving the United Nations and calling it human rights. And that is expanding his argument here. His perspective, his point of view, is that civil rights is not enough, and in fact is sort of offensive to think that that is all that can be done to help Black people in America. What really needs to be done is human rights need to be considered when we're talking about inequality and the oppression of minorities. His last statement here, he is sort of making a little bit of a dig at what's going on with other immigrants in America. He says that immigrants fresh off the ship, which might be considered an interesting term depending on how it's used. Here, he's just referring to all immigrants. We might want to think that he's talking about immigrants from Europe, but that's not apparent and not abundantly clear. But he's saying that 400 years of basically enslavement have made America what it is. But immigrants can show up and take for granted that same thing that African Americans are still not afforded in America. Here we get a little bit of his tone because we get another exclamation. I can't think of a better case. So we can understand his tone here is almost exasperated. He's distraught. He's almost unbelieving that this is happening and that he has to have this conversation. This is a really different perspective than what he's been talking about the whole time. He's been talking about his education, and now he's giving us almost an additional claim. Education is a way that you can learn about your human rights and what you should be afforded as a person in the world. While that might be great that they could extend to civil rights, you've got to start with human rights first. Let's think overall about Malcolm X's tone and perspective here. His tone throughout the entire text is pretty formal and only gets pointed in a few choice areas. I think that maybe he's doing this on purpose. If you start your text with too aggressive a tone, you might alienate your audience. While Malcolm X is certainly not afraid of being aggressive for what he wants or alienating his audience, this is a carefully crafted choice here to lure you in with a really positive tone about his own personal life, and then at the end sort of give you that disbelief and that agitation with the true disrespect that he has received in America and that he's learned has been going on for a long time. His point of view on the subject has perhaps changed since he first learned to read, but we can be sure that what we're actually seeing here is an older Malcolm X reflecting on his younger self. Next time, what we're going to do is we're going to look at this text overall, and we're going to complete a rhetorical analysis framework called soapstone, which is a really good way that you can kind of boil down an argument before you start to write about it.